The freight crew who brought her in didn't know what they had. Neither did I at first. They'd found her wedged between two refrigerated cargo pallets on the lower deck of a grain hauler out of the Meth-Orin run. A hatchling, they said, about the size of a large dog, still breathing, unresponsive to light. They'd wrapped her in insulation, batting, and carried her the length of the freight hub to our annex because they didn't know where else to go. I don't think they expected anyone to be awake at that hour. I was, because I am always awake at that hour. The Kareth 9 triage annex is not a prestigious posting. It's bolted to the underside of the main station like an afterthought. 12 berths, 2 staff, filtration unit that sounds like a man clearing his throat, and a mandate to handle any non-humanoid biological emergency that falls below the dignity threshold of the main medical hub 2 levels up. I had put in 11 years there. My colleague Pern handled the day shift. I handled the nights, and I had long since stopped expecting anything to surprise me. The hatchling surprised me. She was mottled pale gray, scales the color of old ice, compact and saurian in the way that only the very young of a true draconic line can be. The wings not yet large enough, fold cleanly, the claws already disproportionately formed, the tail curled tight against her haunches, as though she were still conserving warmth, whatever heat source she'd last been near. Her eyes were open. They were completely white. Not the white of fear or shock, the white of a structure that had never developed correctly. Clouded from membrane to depth, ever like Kareth 9 had to offer, she could not see any of it. I called up to the main hub as a matter of procedure, 3 times. The duty physician, on the first call, told me draconic cases required specialist sign-off, and he didn't have the clearance code. The second said she looked non-viable and recommended we log the find and hold for species repatriation. The third didn't answer. I left a message, filled in the intake form myself under marginal species, unaccompanied, and put the hatchling in the warmest berth we had. That was the beginning of 23 days. I had no draconic training beyond the 2-hour module that comes with the general exotic species certification. It covers respiratory distress, puncture wounds, and the correct way to restrain a juvenile if it becomes aggressive. It says nothing about feeding a blind hatchling who cannot locate a food source by sight. It says nothing about the fact that she navigated entirely by vibration. That I learned on the second night, when I walked too softly, and she startled so badly, she cracked her head against the berth frame, and I stood, very still, and said something low and meaningless until she found the vibration of my voice through the floor plating and settled. After that I always walked heavier than I needed to. I hummed when I changed her dressings. Small things. They worked. Freight crew had filed their report and moved on. The repatriation request sat in a queue somewhere up the chain. Status pending, which in station bureaucracy means it will remain pending until someone with authority decides it is worth their attention. I submitted a follow-up on day 5. On day 10, I received an automated acknowledgement both times. On day 14, a junior administrator sent a note suggesting that, if the animal was stable and not a threat to station operations, the most efficient path was to continue interim care until the queue cleared. I wrote back that I understood and returned to my shift. She was growing. Not quickly. Hatchlings of her apparent lineage are slow developers, but perceptibly. The wing membranes were darkening at the joints, which I had read was a sign of proper thermoregulation establishing itself. She had learned the dimensions of the berth and moved through it without collision. She had learned me specifically, the weight of my step, the register of my voice, the particular rhythm I used when I was checking her temperature versus when I was simply passing by. She would raise her head at the second. She would lower it and press her jaw to the warming panel at the first. Cooperative in the way of a creature that has decided, with whatever faculty serves as trust in a species I didn't fully understand, that the arrangement is acceptable. I noticed the shadow on day 16. Kareth 9's lower observation deck runs along the exterior of the annex level, separated from us by a long corridor and a viewport that looks out over the freight approach lanes. I use that corridor to take my breaks. On the 16th night I walked it at the midpoint of my shift and saw, through the viewport, something large resting on the exterior platform gantry. The station's running lights caught the edge of it. The folded line of a wing, the ridge of a back, the faint gleam of scales that were not pale gray but deep amber brown, layered and ancient in the way that spoke of size accumulated over decades, rather than years. It was still. It was watching the annex level, not the freight lanes. It was there the next night, and the night after. I didn't report it. I'm not sure why exactly. It wasn't threatening anything. It wasn't doing anything at all. It was simply present at a distance, watching in the patient way of a creature that has decided watching is enough for now. On the 23rd morning, 2 hours before my shift ended, heard the annex door. She came in without announcement. That is perhaps the wrong word. She filled the annex. The Veth Soren Conclave matriarch was not in the way of spectacle. She was large in the way of geological formations, a thing that has simply been accumulating mass and stillness for longer than the station around her has existed. Scales were the deep amber brown I had seen through the viewport, ridged and weathered, the color of old iron where the light caught the raised edges. Her eyes were the color of dark copper, and they were entirely clear, and they moved across the annex. The intake forms pinned above the desk, the filtration unit, the warming berth, me. With a steadiness that I recognized somehow as professional, she was assessing. The hatchling raised her head the moment the door opened, not in alarm, in recognition. She made a sound I had not heard from her before, low and resonant in her chest, something sang between a vibration and a breath. And she moved to the edge of the berth and held herself there, wings half spread, waiting. The matriarch looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She spoke in Veth Soren, which I do not speak. A moment later, a translation unit at her collar rendered it in standard. You kept her alive. I said I had done what I could with what we had. You kept her alive for 23 days without training, without support, and without jurisdiction. She said the last word with something that might have been precision, or might have been contempt for the concept. You did not transfer her. You did not log her as non-viable. You did not stop. I said someone had to. The matriarch was quiet. The hatchling had crossed the berth and was pressing her jaw against the matriarch's foreleg, and the matriarch lowered her great head and rested it briefly against the hatchling's back. A gesture so unguarded and private that I looked away, toward the intake desk, and found something to read there. When I looked back, the matriarch was watching me again. She is the last of the Veth Soran primary line, she said through the translator. There were 7 of us watching the freight lanes when the hauler crew brought her in. We could not approach. Station law. Conclave business requires a filed approach authorization that takes longer to process than a hatchling can survive without care. Watch to see what the station would do. She paused. The station did nothing. You are not the station. I said I was aware of that. I had the paperwork to prove it. Something shifted in her expression that the translator could not render. It may have been the closest a Veth Soren matriarch comes to a quiet laugh. She straightened. She said a phrase in Veth Soren, and the translator gave it to me as Keth, Farah. She who did not look away. It is a formal designation. It is old. We have not used it in some time. She held my gaze. It is yours now. I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked her, which felt inadequate and may have been the wrong protocol entirely, and she accepted it without comment, which I took as sufficient. They left before my shift ended. The matriarch, the hatchling, 3 others I had not seen arrive who materialized from somewhere in the freight corridor. The berth was empty and warm. Stripped and remade it for the next intake, filed the discharge paperwork under repatriated, status resolved, and refilled the filtration unit's coolant. At the end of my shift, I walked the observation corridor one more time. The gantry outside the viewport was empty. The freight lanes moved in their ordinary patterns, traffic and light, and the long, slow drift of haulers coming in from the Meth Orin run. I stood there for a moment, longer than I needed to. Then I turned around and went to finish my notes.